Alaskans should know that commercial fishing is really the industry that developed the state. The only real fishermen were the fishermen who knew how to sail. After World War II, it was probably pretty clear that the sailboats were not going to last that much longer. And you can't talk about commercial fishing in this state unless you talk about Bristol Bay, and you can't understand Bristol Bay unless you understand the sailboat and how it was developed. It's a charming but miserable history. We've still fished more years in sailboats out of that fishery than we have in powerboats. If we're going to save anything from that era, it should be the sailboat.
Built in 1914, this Lake Clark Bristol Bay double-ender sailing boat fished the graveyard cannery at the mouth of the Kvichak River.
We're all here to dedicate a new exhibit, a maritime exhibit. A lot of folks don't understand that Lake Clark was established in good part to preserve red salmon spawning habitat for the Kvichak red salmon fishery. And this boat helps us to draw that connection for people who visit the park. This boat was fished in Bristol Bay. It started its life in Bristol Bay, and now it's ending its watertime career, at least here in the headwaters for Bristol Bay.
I'm Craig Corey. My father, John Corey, was the one that purchased the boat in Bristol Bay and brought it up the Kvichak into Lake Clark.
My dad was very proud of this boat. He says, I bought this boat from John Corey. I don't know when we bought the thing, or he bought the thing. I think it was about 1961. It was pretty well skinned up by the time I gave it to the Park Service. And I guess that was a couple of years ago, so we owned it for somewhat about 40 years. I sure want to thank the Park Service for their significant effort and interest in preserving the boat.
You know, you don't pull off an exhibit like this anywhere very easily, and it's much more difficult in a remote place like Port Allsworth.
The Lake Clark National Park and Preserve Bristol Bay Double-Ender is one of the dozen or so museum-quality boats of its kind in existence. The story of that fabulously rich fishery is found in its timbers, rigging, and sail. The preservation of one of the last of its kind enables park visitors to better understand how the world's greatest salmon fishery was conducted during the age of wooden sailboats from the late 19th to the mid-20th century.
I was born here in Naknek. My dad came there about 1896, I believe, and settled there. He was Norwegian from Stavanger, and I think he started sailing when he was about 10 with his dad, a coastal freighter in Norway.
My father was from Copenhagen, Denmark. He was an old sailor on Swearview days. And my mother was born out on the Aleutian Islands, on Akitan or on Alaska somewhere. My dad was the caretaker watchman for the Red Salmon Canning Company for 25 years.
Melvin and Poikin were cousins who lived side by side in Naknek.
Somebody asked me, when did you start fishing? I said, since I was born, practically.
I don't know. I started fishing really for money about 1942. It was during the war.
The Pacific canned salmon industry began on a barge in the Sacramento River in 1864 and quickly moved up the coast to Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, Southeast Alaska, and Cook Inlet, finally ending in Bristol Bay in 1884. By 1890, there were 4 operating salmon canneries in Bristol Bay, and the double-ender fishing boat, or gill netter, was becoming widely used by bay fishermen.
They'd bring them up on ships and then unload them when they got here. They'd sort of line up as many as they could fit on the deck. At any one time, there may have been 1,000 of them fishing.
So the way you were a good fisherman is you knew how to sail and you knew how to use the wind to get to the places where the fish were.
Getting around too when it was calm was hard. You got out these oars and tried to get somewhere. So there was a lot of our friends that had power boats would tow us around when we needed a tow. And the canneries all had little, maybe 40-foot monkey boats, they call them, just out there in the fishing ground just for towing sailboats around when it was calm.
Might have it upside down. Where's this? Get the top ring, Melvin. Get the top ring. Swing that bottom one through first, Harry.
There's a second.
See, I don't get twisted.
You go that way.
We gotta bring all the sail back here.
I haven't heard him yell at me from the inside of a boat in a long time.
Got it? Okay. You guys got hold of it.
We need more, huh?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we do. Last year, man, used to just walk it up.
Once that staple's gonna thing up the edge of the boat. Whoa, stop.
Lift it up to
Lift it up.
Waiting on this end.
Is the bear in the way?
No. You gotta pull it back.
Kind of reminds me of that era.
Back one. Pull it back.
Okay.
Another foot. Another foot. Now tip it up. Straight up. Last floppy.
Yeah.
We have a wedge that we got down here.
Shim like that.
You don't have any shim?
No.
Now we take the end of the sail. Got that big fat captain? Into the boom.
There were about 9-10 canneries right near Naknek then, and the companies owned the boats, the gear, the nets, everything. And you just came there and provided a body to use their gear and everything, and they paid you accordingly, of course. And they just about had full control of who was going to fish and who wasn't.
In those days, you know, you were out there fishing basically 6 days a week, 24 hours a day.
Oh, you'd get up at night, your charley horses and your legs and your arms, everything's sore from pulling that net in.
There were no stores at all except the company store, you know, and they'd allow you to charge your credit stuff all winter long, and after the next fishing payday, you'd pay them back.
But there were some canneries that weren't as good as others that did, like Hungry Pearson didn't have a good reputation. They didn't treat their fishermen very good as far as, that's why they called it Hungry Pearson.
One cannery, all they fed them was salmon and rice all summer, or pasta or something. But where I'd fish, it was always good. You'd come in from fishing and they have steaks all fried and ready for you and stuff like that. But I know a lot of people were in debt continually to the canneries. You fished in their boat, their nets, you lived in their bunkhouse, you ate their food in their mess hall, and you know, you were forced to, and that was it. They had complete control. It was hard to get a fish price also out of them. We used to have strikes for a fish price occasionally, but usually by the 4th of July they were all settled because they knew the big run was going to hit. Most everyone paid the same price. It was kind of an antitrust thing. In fact, they had a lot of court cases over that. The processors kept control for years till statehood.
The first fishermen were usually the Scandinavians and Italian fishermen.
In those days, sailboat days, 90% of fishermen or more were from down south, down Monterey, Astoria, Oregon, around Seattle. The majority of local fishermen, what I call Alaskans, it was very little in those days. Alaska couldn't supply the amount of fishermen we wanted anyway. Even today they couldn't do it.
The dynamic of that whole period now is, to me, is romantic. I mean, not only just a sailboat, But you have this whole mixture of cultures, the Chinese coming in to work in the canneries, and the Japanese, and the Filipinos, and then the colorful Scandinavians, and the Italians, and the sort of cannery little fights they used to have among themselves about who were the best fishermen, and you hear that stuff, and it's but it was also a hard drinking time.
There was a lot of bootlegging going on.
In early 20th century Alaska, many people had nicknames, and Bristol Bay had more than its fair share.
Naknek was full of nicknames. Mine was Poikin. Well, there's argument, feet flying fin, the traveling fin, gold fangs, flat-nosed Henry. I got some of those that's worse that I won't mention.
There was a lot of competition, you see. You'd go to the tally scout on load, and there, how many fish you got? How many fish? Everybody wanted to know, I never raced, but, well, I guess I did when we were fishing. There were these two old fins that had been around forever, and they really were seamen. And I always pulled up our nets about the same time. They used to close at a regular time in the fishing. We raced them across the bay, and we beat them. I don't think they talked to us the rest of the season.
In those days, fishermen respected each other. They let you drift before they'd set theirs to get out of the way. There's a couple of guys they'd cork you, but most of the guys were gentlemen. So you never were trying to rush each other.
Well, I fished in one once that had been converted to a power boat. But in the headlog, it had carved in there 3,435 fish. I guess he had fish in the forecastle all the way to the stern. But he was a real good fisherman.
It was a rough go. There was no heat. You slept under a tent like that, and it leaked. We had reindeer hides for mattresses, rolled them in the bottom. They had them so they fit right out at the bottom of the boat. And our blankets would get damp and wet. Well, you had them little Primus stoves to cook on, and pulling the net over the back end on one of these things. You had 900 feet over there, and you had no power. You had to just pull it in by hand. Pile the fish in here and pick them and throw them in the business. It was a rough go.
Bristol Bay is full of big sandbars, some of them right out there in the middle of the bay, and that was bad in the storm. You get blown on there, and they're helpless. And a lot of them were blown ashore. I don't remember anybody carrying life vests or life preservers in these sailboats.
You really got the sense that they knew they were fishing in those days in something that was old and outdated and unsafe.
Even the power boats up there, they lost. In one summer, Bristol Bay Packers lost 14 power boats. I watched men drown though. Couldn't get to him. Boat swamped.
In 1951, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service finally issued regulations that allowed power boats to operate in Bristol Bay. Power boats quickly eclipsed sailboats because they were safer, faster, and easier to operate. Gradually, more fishermen began to own their boats and gain more independence from the cannery owners. The absolute control of the fishery by the canneries began to diminish, and as the 1950s evolved, the era of the wooden Bristol Bay sailing boat faded into history. After 1950, more than 1,000 double-unders were scrapped, burned, converted to power, sold, or abandoned along the Bristol Bay coastline. And that is why the Lake Clark boat is such an important historic icon, emblematic of the world's greatest salmon fishery.
It certainly opened up the fishery to people who didn't have to know as much about the bay. There was a whole knowledge and understanding of that bay that was intimate, that resulted from sailing. When power comes along, eventually all that knowledge is gone.
From 1883, I think, was when the first cannery started, until 1952. That's all there were. So it was 69 years of our fishing history, and then they hung on another 15, 18, maybe 20 years in some cases as conversions. So there was the majority of the history of fishing in Alaska was under these boats.
Still fished more years in sailboats out of that fishery than we have in powerboats. So it's still, you know, when you look at it from that standpoint, it was the vessel most important for developing that fishery. So if we're going to save anything from that era, it should be the sailboat.
We need a rope. I need about a 8-foot piece of rope or better.
You said 8 feet. And
Yeah, I was just estimating.
he was estimating.
Don't have to be
He was
exact.
just estimating wrong. Who's the skipper on this thing?
Lake Clark was never a fishery itself. Nevertheless, most people who lived there from 1900 forward would have been connected to the fishery, the growing fishery that developed at the mouth of the Queechak and in the Naknek River. Sailboats was what that fishery thrived on. Those people who live there now, their fathers and grandfathers broke into that fishery and in a short period of time proved their mettle in a sailboat.
You want the short end up here? Okay.
We ought to have all the Johnsons and Munsons up here.
That one we got long enough. Like that?
Yep.
And
Take
then
it back. Take it back.
put it up on the cleat.
Yep. I gotta get out of this tub. I've been in it long enough. Where's the ladder?
I got it coming right here.
Thank you.
Watch out, he's looking some
Well, I'll tell you, when I'm his age and I'm this spry, I'll be feeling pretty good. Thank you, sir.
You betcha. That was fun. Haven't done that either. That's good for sailing, man. You're tacking now. You got fair wind. I could see Mother there with her head bowed in prayer as she prayed for her wandering son. There's a little old church in the valley, the little old church of my dreams. I could see Mother there with her head bowed in prayer as she prayed for her wandering son.